Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I'm with Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, former ambassador to China, former High Commissioner to Pakistan. He speaks and reads Mandarin and has also worked in Washington, D.C. in India's mission, and Tanvi Madan, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C. So I'm connecting the time zones between Pune, where Ambassador Bambawale is, Tanvi is in Washington, D.C., and I'm in New Delhi. Welcome to the Print Debates.
Thank you.
Good to be on the show.
So, of course, the big question is the first Quad summit has just taken place between the leaders of the four countries, Prime Minister Modi of India, Joe Biden of the US, Prime Minister Scott Morrison of Australia, and the Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga. Ambassador Bambawale, if I'd like you to go first. Your first comments on the Quad, and also the NPC, which is the National People's Congress, has concluded its 10-day long meeting in China. But your first comments on these events.
Thank you so much, Jyoti. A pleasure to be with you and with Tanvi Madan on this show. I guess the important point coming out of the first Quad summit level meeting is how quickly the Quad as a concept, as a grouping, has progressed. If you look back on the 6th of October 2020, where the four foreign ministers from the four countries met physically in Tokyo, and then with the Biden administration being voted into office by the people of the United States, you had a virtual meeting of the foreign ministers. The new US Secretary of State was there. And today you've had a meeting of the leaders of the four countries. And that probably indicates the kind of concern that there is across the world about actions and activities by China, the aggression and assertiveness being displayed by China over the last 12 to 18 months all around the world. And let me stop there, hand it back to you, and we'll talk about the NPC as we go on. But I believe that the NPC has closed today, and this is the once in a year meeting of the full National People's Congress, the Chinese Parliament, so to say. So It's always a very special event, and it's not going to meet in this format, at least for the rest of the year till next year this time.
Right. Ms. Madan, I'd like to draw your attention to what Prime Minister Modi said at the Quad, and he spoke, or at least the video that we have so far is that he's spoken for 1 minute, 48 seconds, a really brief intervention, if you like. Perhaps there was a larger discussion that we don't know about, but he said, it is good to be among friends. And I'd like to ask you, in the light of the disengagement at the Pangong Tso in Ladakh, the fact that four leaders from four democracies across the world have met virtually, of course, what do you make of it?
I think it is significant that they met, not just for this summit, but also the ministerial. Partly for the reason that, especially here and in Australia to some degree, also Japan, India is seen as the reluctant member of the Quad, that when there's a sensitive time with China, it will not do something with the rest of the partners. But what we've actually seen now over the last few years, pretty consistently, we saw this after Doklam, but we've now also seen it over the last few weeks, that in India is, while it is engaging when necessary, when it must with China, it is in parallel also strengthening these relationships that help it preserve a favorable balance of power in the region, that can help it ensure that there is not a unipolar Asia dominated by an assertive China. And these partners can also help ensure that India, which has a capabilities gap with China, can offer solutions and alternatives in the region which India cannot do alone. So I think it is significant that we have seen, despite the disengagement talks, where you could have seen in India that said, this might provoke China, let's not do this, that they have moved ahead, and they've actually come out of this process with a very tangible outcome. Because I have been of the view that the Quads actually, even in consulting, is when they consult with each other, that's progress. That is an actual outcome. But
Right.
for people who want to see proof of concept that the Quad can cooperate, I think this vaccine initiative that they've generated is quite significant.
And this vaccine initiative, Ambassador Bambawale, is about, well, at least the early reports that are coming out, is that the US and Japan will finance the ramping up of the development of the COVID-19 vaccine in India, and that it will be distributed or sold or, sort of sent to at least the Southeast Asian nations, which are neighbors of China. Do you think that's significant?
I think it's significant, Jyoti, and the reason for that is now, when you look across the world and you look across the Indo-Pacific and even beyond the Indo-Pacific, there is now an authoritarian perspective or an authoritarian view which is always out there, and there is a democratic view which is always out there. And
but we have all dealt with democracies. We've all dealt with authoritarian regimes. It's not as if for the first time, that you're dealing with authoritarian countries. I mean, the Americans have always dealt with rogue regimes, and so has India.
No, but I think it is very important here that the four democracies are coming together and taking various initiatives to work together and spread that work across the globe. I think that's very important.
What would you say, Tanvi, to that?
I agree. I think, there are two or three different things that I think that make this vaccine initiative important. I think one, it is actually going to be helpful to the region. It takes on the Chinese criticism and that of other critics that the Quad doesn't do very much, or that it is a destabilizing alliance-like body, an Asian NATO, as Wang Yi occasionally labels it.
What's wrong with being called an Asian NATO? I mean, Wang Yi was using the word pejoratively, that's the Chinese foreign minister, but isn't it an Indo-Pacific NATO?
No, because an alliance means something very specific. An alliance in the strictest sense of the term, and that's how we should use it and take it, means that countries have security obligations to each other. That's not the case. This is more like a coalition of the willing and capable. It can still be significant. It's just not an alliance. But the reason Wang Yi does that, he's also doing it instrumentally, which is why I think it needs to be pushed back on, which is he's trying to stoke Southeast Asian concerns about the Quad, saying, or for that matter, South Korean concerns about the Quad, that, this is going to be an exclusive club, you will be left out, and they will destabilize the region. So this is where when you have a vaccine initiative that now says that if you're Southeast Asian who needs and is waiting for that vaccine for yourself or your grandparent or your parent, the Quad is actually adding something to your life. It is adding a benefit. It is going back to the spirit of the Quad when it was the Tsunami Core Group, that these countries are pooling together their capabilities, logistics, financing, manufacturing, to change your life for the better. And so it helps take on that Chinese criticism. A second benefit, as countries cooperate together, you learn to build infrastructure for cooperation, you build trust, you build habits of cooperation, right. Then help you do this, take this to other realms as well. So I do think in that sense, it's quite important and significant. And I think to Ambassador Bambawale's point, the democracies have taken a hit the reputation of democracies has taken a hit over this last year. China has said, look, democracies can't handle COVID. They cannot respond to COVID effectively. They seem to ignore the South Korean, Taiwanese, and New Zealand experience. But regardless, for the US and Korea in particular, this is one way of showing democracies can respond to COVID.
So, Ambassador Bambawale, can I ask you the Ladakh question? I mean, there has been this is now about a month ago that Indian and Chinese troops disengaged at the Pangong Tso. You have been very vocal and articulate about that, and we were talking about the next steps, whether it was in the hot springs or the Gogra area and elsewhere. Why do you think the Quad, or do you think that the Quad is sort of, it's like a pause button in the middle of this disengagement process?
No, I don't think it's a pause button at all. But I think that the fact that India has pushed back against China, not only militarily, but also geopolitically and also economically.
But can you explain what does that mean?
Kind of result that we have got on the ground in Ladakh. And of course, we have had disengagement only in one part of Ladakh, in one subsector of Ladakh. There is still a long distance to walk, a long distance to go, and we will see how those negotiations and discussions go. But definitely on the geopolitical side, the fact that the Quad is strengthening is a signal to the Chinese.
But do you feel that the Americans are so weakened now that they need three other players for them to sort of address the tensions that they have with China?
No, I think it's always good to have, President Biden has said very, very clearly that he's going to work with allies and partners. And here's an example. There are two allies of the United States in this grouping and one definite partner, which is India. So here you have a specific example of what the president said at the very start of his term, that he would be working with allies and partners. And here is a concrete example and a very specific example of how he is going to ensure that his country, the United States, works with allies and partners.
Tanvi, you mentioned early on that India was seen as a reluctant player in the Quad coalition or in the Quad grouping. Do you think that India has sort of shared its reluctance now, and the fact that Prime Minister Modi has participated in this coalition of the willing demonstrates that?
Well, I've actually always had a different view, which is, you can see it as reluctance, but you can also see it as a step-by-step approach, feeling the stones as you walk across a river, and you're doing it while you're holding hands with kind of three other people, because part of what you're trying to do is assess how far they're willing to go. You're also taking the time to assess whether they are going to stay the course on China. Because India has a memory, and Ambassador Bambawale was in government then, where, the Quad the last time around, because of countries, Australia publicly declared that the Quad was a one-off at a joint press conference with the Chinese foreign minister, and basically walked out. Now, the other countries involved also had some concerns and priorities with China. But I think in some ways, the fact that India and the other Quad countries have done this step by step, to me actually makes it more sustainable, because you bought into the process over time, and you've built you got buy-in from various. I think it is one test is the Biden administration coming in amongst the Quads. This is the first change of government in any of the Quad countries since it was revived. Leaving aside Abe-san leaving and Suga-san coming in at Prime Minister's office in Japan. But the fact that even the Biden administration has come in and said, look, we're not going to just embrace the Quad. We're actually going to enhance and expand it, not in membership, but in scale and scope.
Right. So Ambassador Bambawale explained to me the following, which is that all four countries are hugely economically dependent on China. The US and China have a very strong economic relationship. India is, to a large extent, dependent on China. And we've seen sort of some conflicting reports over the last few days. One is that Huawei has won an Airtel contract worth 300 crore rupees, but then officials are also saying, Government of India officials are saying that they are not going to let Huawei enter the telecom industry because of safety concerns. But this dependence on China, and then the fact that you want to address these tensions that you talk about, how do you sort of cohere these?
No, there is an economic exchange between all countries, including the four countries of the Quad and China. There's no doubt about that, because China is a very important player in the world today. China is the largest exporting nation in the world today, is the largest trading nation in the world today. So obviously, all countries across the globe do trade with China. But having said that, I think the world which we are moving towards is one where, while there may not be a complete decoupling between China and other countries in the world, there will definitely be a rebalancing of the economic exchanges and interactions that take place between those countries and China. So I think we're moving into that kind of situation. Where India is concerned, I think you will definitely see a kind of rebalancing of the economic equation between India and China. We will try to manufacture more in India itself of certain goods and commodities where we have a competitive advantage. And I'll give you one example. Yeah. Today, we import a lot of our active pharmaceutical ingredients from China. I can see that the production manufacture of APIs is going to go up in India because we have a possibility of manufacturing them here. We have a competitive advantage in manufacturing them here, and we will reduce our dependence on imported APIs from China over the next few years. I definitely see that happening.
So, Tanvi, how do you look at the visit in the next week or so between the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan with their Chinese counterparts, and they're meeting in Alaska, Wang Yi, that you just referred to? What do you make of that?
I think there are two things to think about. One is on the engagement side, and one is on what is leading up to that engagement. And I'll start with that latter first, which is this administration has been very clear and quite public about the fact that they see China as a major competitor. That, as Secretary Blinken said, that they will compete, cooperate, and even see China as adversarial in some instances when necessary, and respond that way. But you've also seen National Security Advisor Sullivan say that the US wants to deal with China and go into negotiations with China from a position of strength. And that means to be able to build some leverage. And that means both domestic strengthening at home, recovering from COVID, expanding the innovation base here, but also kind of working and shoring up American alliances and partnerships. And this is where the Quad, of course, fits in. And so if you look at to quote the Home Minister, "Aap chronology samjhi." They have, before President Biden talked to Xi Jinping, he spoke to all the Indo-Pacific allies and partners, the key ones, including India. Similarly, you saw Secretary Blinken speak to his Indo-Pacific counterparts before he talked to his Chinese counterpart, and that readout was very tough. You've also seen now ahead of this meeting, this Alaska meeting, that you're seeing this Quad meeting take place after a Quad ministerial, right, as well as 2+2 meetings that Secretary of Defense Austin will have and Secretary of State Blinken will have with their Japanese and then Korean counterparts. And of course, as that meeting takes place in Alaska, you're going to see Secretary Austin on his way to India for an in-person trip very early into the administration. And so this is laying the groundwork to go into those negotiations with China, where they have made clear on the US side that this will be very much, yes, it is good to have channels open, even perhaps stabilize the relationship, but there are many areas of disagreement: Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, Taiwan, but also, the detention of Canadians, the economic coercion that is being employed against Australia. So bringing up allied and partner issues as well. And so, yes, I think it is in everybody's interest for that competition not to go to confrontation. So very much like India keeps channels open with China, EAM Jaishankar speaks to his counterpart. See it in that context, and we'll wait and see where it goes. But the Chinese might be trying to create a wedge between allies and partners, and I think that's something all the allies and partners or like-minded countries have to guard against. You have to wedge-proof things like the Quad.
And Ambassador Bambawale, to you, the same question. Do you think that the Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken meeting with their Chinese counterparts, how do you see that coming so close, hot on the heels of this Quad summit meeting? Do you think that the Americans are speaking in two voices?
No, I don't think so at all. In fact, it is natural that when you have a new US administration in office, in place, that it will engage with the rest of the world, particularly because that is one of the objectives of the current presidency in the United States, that they want to re-engage with the world. And if that means re-engaging not just with Japan and Australia and India or with the Quad, but also re-engaging with China, so be it. I would pick up on the point that Tanvi has just made about, about the Quad remaining strong. Yes, sure, the Chinese will try to drive wedges amongst the Quad countries. But I think the understanding amongst them and their understanding of what's happening in geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and around the globe is very, very clear. So I don't see this possibility of China driving a wedge of any of these four countries now reneging or pulling back as far as the Quad is concerned.
Ambassador Bambawale, can I also ask you about the National People's Congress that has just concluded in Beijing, and your comments on that, and how you see this 10-day the meeting that has just finished?
Yeah, so when I said that this is the annual meeting of China's parliament, it takes place once a year. I wanted to juxtapose it to the kind of parliamentary debate which takes place in our four countries, the India, the US, Japan, and Australia, where parliament meets all the time throughout the year. Many
all
occasions.
The time. It's thrice a year only in India. So.
No, but thrice a year for long durations, for long periods, and we have a parliament session in which is taking place even right now.
Right now, yeah.
So when you meet for 10 days in a whole year, you know what is the nature of that parliament. It has obviously rubber stamped whatever had been put before it by the Communist Party of China leadership, which had already agreed, and we have seen that happening over the past few months. They had agreed on the new 5-year plan, the 14th 5-year plan of China. That has been approved and rubber stamped by the National People's Congress. The long-term 2035 goals up till 2035, which the Chinese leadership had approved, and which the Central Committee as well as the Politburo of China had approved earlier, have again been rubber stamped by this parliament. So I think I wouldn't overplay what has happened, but I think one of the important takeaways from these sessions, annual sessions of the National People's Congress, their full sessions, is the public interface that many of the leaders of China, including the premier, including the foreign minister, have with the media. And I think that is something that we need to study a little more closely and a little more carefully.
There are three things that I noticed, and it'd be interesting to hear Ambassador Bambawale's view on this too. 3 or 4 things that struck me as perhaps having implications for India, or at least saying something about the relationship. Is that one, while Wang Yi was kind of moderate, not it wasn't some of the heated rhetoric we heard a few weeks ago. He did kind of, China's very much still in that zone that the broader relationship should be kept separate from the boundary issue, which is kind of the contra to the Indian position that, without maintaining peace and tranquility at the border, you can't go back to kind of a normal relationship or the broader relationship. You can't keep them separate. And Wang Yi was still very much saying that. A couple of the other things, I think, the fact that there have been some announcements that suggest that as part of the 5-year plan, they will be improving and enhancing their infrastructure and connectivity in Tibet. Which would have implications for India potentially. And not just in Tibet, but crossing over into, say, for example, Nepal and connecting up. Also, the potential kind of building dams, the dam constructions on the lower reaches of what we call the Brahmaputra on their side, and the implications that might have. The other thing, which is kind of not quite directly India related, but it was interesting in the chronology of, and this is all very planned in terms of when the questions are asked, who gets to ask a question. I think it was the second question after CGTN, the Chinese state-run channel. Second question went to TASS, the Russian state-run agency, where they asked about China-Russia relations. So it just tells you, and I think, the China-US relationship was way down the list. China-India was even, way down that list. And so it's just interesting to me that it suggests a certain priority, which, as for India, what happens in the China-Russia relationship is crucial.
Well, Ambassador Bambawale, can I ask you about the Wang Yi, again, his attempt at separating the border from the rest of the relationship? Do you think that India is willing to go down that route, or are we still saying that we have to look at the entire relationship, especially in the wake of the disengagement process in Ladakh?
Look, Jyoti, the Chinese game plan is very simple. That the rest of the relationship moves on as it was earlier, whereas what happens in the border should be treated separately. So that is their playbook, that's their copybook, that's what they would like to happen. Now for India, it's diametrically on the opposite side, that we say that the rest of the relationship cannot move forward as long as there's no peace and tranquility on the border or along the line of actual control between the two countries. And in fact, I think what has happened since April or May of 2020 and now the last 9 or 10 months or maybe even longer, as you rightly pointed out, has led to a complete change in the India-China relationship. It will find a new equilibrium, it will find a new normal, but it cannot be business as it was earlier. So I think the quicker the Chinese understand that, and I'm sure that they will understand that, and they have understood it, but I don't see the India-China relationship ever returning to what it was, say, pre-April 2020. It has changed tremendously, and it will continue to change in the coming weeks and months ahead, even if there is a complete disengagement process in Ladakh. So I think the relationship has been damaged immeasurably, and because of Chinese actions, military actions on the ground. And as a result of that, do not think of a reset in India-China relations is going to mean a complete change in India-China relations from what it was earlier.
So are you saying that the next steps in the disengagement, and when you move to the next sector, that the Chinese must go back to the line of actual control and that India will not accept anything otherwise?
Absolutely. The bottom line is restoration of status quo ante as it existed before the Chinese moved their troops.
So just one second, Tanvi, I just want to continue with this. Ambassador Bambawale, what happens? There's been a lot of talk about the Chinese saying that the 1959 claim line is where we are right now, and this is where meaning this is where the Chinese are going to stay, and that even if there is a buffer zone, like there is in the Pangong Tso area today, that this buffer zone will begin within the Indian side of the LAC and not on the other side, or not equally divided.
Jyoti, the important point is that there is a disputed boundary or a disputed border between India and China. And the only way to settle a dispute of this kind is through negotiations, talks, discussions across the table. If the Chinese think that they are going to be able to settle it unilaterally by military coercion, I think they have a second thing coming. There's no way that is going to lead to any kind of conclusive, settlement of the border between India and China, the boundary between India and China. So I don't see the minor tactical gains that they may have made or could possibly have made over the last few months as being much. They need to discuss this with India. It is only when both the countries sit down at the negotiating table and talk about where the boundary will lie that you can find a solution to that particular problem.
And India will will go back to the heights on the Kailash range if necessary.
No, these are small tactical issues. I don't want to go into them because I am not a military expert, so I really cannot comment on them. But I've tried to comment on the larger issue of an unsettled boundary between India and China. And doing the kind of things that the Chinese have done since May 2020 is definitely no way of settling it.
So last questions to both of you, and I'm sorry for this divergence on the India-China border issue, but I'm just trying to connect this with the Quad. Do you think, Tanvi, that the four leaders, whether off the record or not in front of the camera, or even otherwise, that they would be talking about the face-off in Ladakh?
Well, I actually don't think it's a divergence. I think if Indian concerns about China had not been heightened, you might not have seen, for instance, India feeling the need to deepen such a coalition. And so to me, this time last year, I wrote a long piece on India's approach to China, and I called it competitive engagement. Today, I would say that it's moved into a phase of competitive coexistence. Which means that, yes, they'll get back to the table, but it's going to be different because there's zero trust. These kind of diplomacy is based on agreements. And if you cannot trust that the other side is going to stick to those agreements, as the case, not just India, but everybody has found, it just violates agreements whenever it wants, whether that's on Hong Kong, whether that's with India, whether that's with Southeast Asian countries, then the question is you have to move to a zone where you work with others, for example, with the Quad countries. And I think, the top sources apparently have admitted that, yes, the LAC situation did come up. And of course, it would naturally come up because, for all the why does the Quad, not cooperate? consultation is a key part of what the Quad does. And I think they'll all be sharing experiences and perspectives and updates on perceptions of China, but also approaches to China. In fact, that is one way to actually wedge-proof the Quad, because you're transparent with each other about what you're doing with China or not doing. And so I think what India will probably be saying is, yes, we will engage with China, but the nature, the expectations of that, and the extent of that engagement with China is perhaps changed in a real way than it would have been a year ago.
Now, Ambassador Bambawale, last question to you, but India talks about a multipolar world a lot. And one of those key poles is the relationship with Russia. But if you have even an informal grouping like the Quad, you don't call it an alliance, you call it a coalition of the willing, like Tanvi said, or a grouping. What does that do to relationships, old trusted relationships, like the one that India has with Russia?
You're absolutely right, Jyoti, that one of the real issues, or let us say challenges in front of Indian diplomacy right now, is to ensure that the India-Russia relationship continues to be stable and move ahead. So you're absolutely right. It's one of our biggest challenges for Indian diplomacy in the coming months and years. But if you permit me, I'll also go back to your previous question, which you directed at Tanvi, but I'd just like to say that what the Chinese have done in Ladakh since May of 2020 is they may have gained a little bit in tactical sense or in a tactical way, but I think they have lost India strategically. And you can see that in the way that the Quad has developed, as I said at the start, from October of 2020 right up till now, when today we've just had the first leaders summit of the Quad countries.
Closing comments from you, Tanvi?
Well, I think, I'll just say, mention on the Russia point, when, for example, China and Russia say, why have this Quad? They have Quads and coalitions too. After all, Russia is putting together, has had a Quad on Afghanistan, and they have not included India in that. China had the BRICS. That is also a coalition. So when China and Russia say to India, why do you have these divisive coalitions? This is not the only coalition India is part of. In fact, India is part of a Russia-India-China trilateral. It's also part of BRICS. It's part of SCO. Those are very different in nature, of course. But India, just like the US shouldn't hold a veto on India's relationships, neither can even a partner like Russia. And Russia also has to be sensitive to India's concerns, both vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis Pakistan. And I'm afraid to say they have shown less sensitivity in recent years about those concerns that India has, particularly, I would say, with deepening defense and technology cooperation with China. And when you have President Putin say and boast about the fact that he is helping enhance the PLA's capabilities a few months after they have killed Indian soldiers, that's not exactly the best way to show friendship to a trusted partner.
Ambassador Bambawale, is India concerned at President Putin's comments about the PLA and the close defense cooperation between Russia and China?
No, we know that there is close defense cooperation between Russia and China, but I think India-Russia relations also stand on their own. There's a solid basis for India-Russia relations, and India will have to work, and Russia will also have to work at ensuring that this partnership moves ahead. One final comment, if you permit me, Jyoti, on today's, the first leaders meeting of the Quad. It looks to me, at least, that the Quad is not like sea foam, which will dissipate once it hits the shore.
Well, that was a nice metaphor to end this conversation. Just on the Russia, India, Afghanistan question, Tanvi, I just wanted to say that I think there's a little bit more to it than meets the eye, but we will discuss this in another program, perhaps in the coming weeks. But thank you so much for your time, Tanvi Madan in Washington, D.C., Ambassador Gautam Bambawale in Pune. Thank you for joining the ThePrint debates.